When I started out in vocational ministry over 20 years ago, I was always the young guy in the room. As a 21-year-old, all the way through my 20s, very rarely was I ever not the youngest minister in a gathering when there would be other pastors getting together. Now that I'm in my 40s, I wish I could say that I'm not the youngest guy in the room, but sadly, in a lot of cases, I still am one of the younger ministers in the room. In 1992, the Barna Group did a study that studied pastors across the United States to determine what the average age of pastors was. And what they discovered in 1992 is that the average age of pastors in the United States was around 42. 25 years later, they did an update of that same study, and they found that the average age of pastors was now 54. Now, what this tells me, it tells me a few things. One, it tells me that pastors are serving longer and living longer, and that's a good thing. We want longevity in ministers. But it's also showing that fewer young men are answering the call and going into vocational ministry. There's lots of reasons for that, and you'll find people talking about that. But what I don't think we're talking about is that this is actually going to cause a crisis in just a few years as as pastors age, as uh, that generation of ministers nears retirement. There's going to be a lot of churches looking for pastors. There's going to be a lot of churches that have a harder time finding pastors. We're already seeing some element of that already. Pastor searches are taking longer. I know of some churches that have gone 2 to 3 years looking for a full time pastor. As churches decline, sadly, many churches that at one time had a full time senior pastor are now moving to a bivocational model. And bivocational carries with it its own challenges, and it changes the dynamic of how churches relate to the pastor and the expectations that go with being a pastor. And some churches are having to close because for various reasons. And one of the reasons that some churches are closing is a lack of qualified pastors. Even in conversations that I've had with churches over the years and friends in other church settings, one thing I've discovered is that the pool of quality, qualified pastors is declining. There was a time where people would go into the ministry and they were seeking to honor God by using the gifts that God had given them. And now, unfortunately, because of realities that sometimes we don't want to talk about, men are not answering that call, and churches are struggling and suffering as a result of it. So, what can churches do to help raise up that next generation of pastors? There was a time where if a young man sensed a call to ministry, he would go off to college, go off to seminary, then come back or go serve somewhere and be a pastor. Those days are largely gone for lots of reasons, and I can go into those at another time. But I think one of the things that we Christians need to understand, and I'm speaking as a Southern Baptist pastor when I say this, we need to be intentional in our churches about raising up pastors, identifying men who are called of God, who have gifts that can serve His church and can be the pastors that God would have the church to have. So, what can a church do? Well, the first thing a church can do is it can value the office of a pastor. One of the things that you hear when you study, talk to pastors, you study the literature out there is pastoral ministry is hard work. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of crazy hours. There's some unrealistic expectations in some churches, and unfortunately, in a lot of churches, the office of pastor is just not valued. And I want you to think about that for a second. If you're a young man, say you're 13, 14 years old, and you see the pastor up on behind the pulpit on Sunday, and you sense God working in your life, potentially calling you into the ministry, but then throughout the week, all you hear is negativity and criticism of that pastor. You're not going to want to go into that field because it's just a hard area. You've got to have a tough skin. When I started out in the ministry, I had an older gentleman in the church I served as a youth minister who told me that one of the things he wanted to help every minister he'd ever seen develop was a big heart, a soft heart, and a tough skin. He said, unfortunately, many pastors have tough hearts and soft skins. And because of that, there's not as much longevity with some guys because they just can't handle the difficulty, the criticism, the pain, the struggle it puts on your family. You add into that the fact that many churches don't pay what we would consider market wages. I mean, somebody who's got an undergraduate degree, gone to seminary and gotten a master's degree, pursued maybe some additional certifications. Many churches just don't have the resources to pay what that level of education would command in a secular marketplace. And so a lot of people aren't going into to pastoral ministry because the church doesn't value the office of pastor. And so I want to encourage churches to value their pastor. Pastors are human. They're going to make mistakes, but the way that we handle that will help encourage and help that next generation step forward. Another thing I think churches need to do is they need to give prospective ministers opportunities. You can call it a pipeline, you can call it a training program, whatever you might want to term it. But when I was younger, most churches, most Baptist churches at least, had Sunday night services. And one of the things that happened a lot on Sunday night services is, let's just be honest. You had certain singers that you would call your Sunday night singers. They weren't bad singers, but they weren't people that you necessarily want to sing on a Sunday morning when the crowd was there. And kind of the same was the case with some preachers. That was a wonderful opportunity for guys that were kind of testing the waters on whether they were called to ministry, for them to not have to face the pressure of a Sunday morning worship service, but instead to have that opportunity with a smaller crowd, people they knew, to just get up in the pulpit and just to share a message. I remember the very first true sermon that I preached was on a Sunday night. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to kind of make some mistakes and to know that it was a safe place to do it. Churches need to give pastors opportunities, whether that's in teaching a Sunday school class, whether that's doing a Wednesday night Bible study, leading in some area. Churches need to provide opportunities if they know a young man that they think might be a prospective pastor at some point. Not necessarily the pastor in that church, but to to be somebody that God might be calling to ministry. Give them the opportunity. Give them the opportunity to test their giftedness and to fail if need be. It also requires that pastors need to have some humility about it and to not be um, driven by ego where they keep young men from stepping into those roles. Then the third thing churches need to do is they need to seek out and equip the called. One of the things that sometimes I think we do is we wait for people to come to us. If you see a young man in your church who's doing ministry, go to that guy and say, have you ever thought about God might be calling you to do ministry, especially in a world where bivocational ministry is becoming more normative? You're not saying they have to leave their job, they have to leave their career, but you want to see them use the gifts that God has given them. And if they're already doing those things by serving in the local church, that we need to applaud that. We need to seek that out and give them opportunities to equip, which might mean help them find some educational opportunities, help them be a part of some ministerial training. Set up a ministerial training program in your church if you have that opportunity and the ability to do that. Partner with other churches that might be needing somebody to fill in for a few weeks. I remember when I was starting out, I traveled all over the state preaching in different churches, giving pastors an opportunity to take a Sunday off. And they might not be there, they might be there. And if they were there, I would have them give me some feedback after the service over lunch or over coffee, where we would sit down. They would say, okay, this is what I enjoyed about your message, this is what I didn't enjoy. And those were wonderful opportunities for me. And we need to give those opportunities to the young men that God is raising up in our church. But this is going to require a time commitment on our part, a willingness to do what is necessary. And it's also going to require that we say somebody that's gifted, that's qualified, that God is using, we might need to send them to somewhere with our blessing and say, we want you to go serve in this church, this community, this congregation. If we do that, God will be blessed. The kingdom will be built up, and we can help stem the impending crisis of pastoral shortages. We may have to get creative in the short term, but I believe God is still calling men to serve as pastors. I believe that God is still doing what He's always done. Churches are not hopeless. God said that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, and we as Christians need to be working diligently to help raise up that next generation, to help raise up men who will go and be in the trenches of pastoral ministry. It is hard work, but it is rewarding work. It is work done for the Lord, and nothing we do for the Lord is ever in vain. So if you're a young man who's considering a call to ministry, find a pastor that you can sit down with, that you can talk to, that can encourage you, mentor you. If if you've got young men in your church that you want to see explore their giftedness, find opportunities to equip them, to train them, to help them. And we do that, then we can help stem this crisis before it reaches a critical point. I pray that we will do what is necessary to raise up that next generation of pastors, that we won't see a decline in the number of godly, qualified men who are going into ministry. And that I think if we do that, we will see churches thrive, and healthier churches help everybody because they help reach the lost with the gospel. Amen, and God bless.